The courtroom buzzed like a hive, filled with muted murmurs and shifting glances. Sunlight filtered through the towering windows, illuminating the wood-paneled walls that seemed to echo authority. At the center of it all sat Judge Arthur Clayton, his robes as black as the storm cloud that followed him wherever he presided. His reputation was as sharp as the gavel he held, unyielding, quick to judgment, and mercilessly condescending. "Miss Wayne," he began, leaning back in his chair with a smug smile that made his wrinkles deepen. His voice, slow and deliberate, sliced through the room like a knife through silk. "Are you lost? This isn't a debate club." The gallery chuckled, a quiet wave of amusement that felt like daggers to Hannah Wayne. She stood alone at the defense table, her petite frame almost swallowed by the oversized gray suit she had borrowed. Her chestnut hair was tied back into a tight ponytail, a few strands escaping to frame her sharp, determined face. In her hands was a stack of papers that appeared far too heavy for her 18 years. "No, Your Honor," she replied, her voice calm but firm. Her eyes, piercing and steady, met his, refusing to waver. "Oh, good," the judge drawled, tapping his gavel lightly on the bench. "Then perhaps you can explain why this court should entertain such an unusual display." He gestured lazily to her, the mockery unmistakable. The laughter grew louder this time, even from the opposing attorney, Rachel Grace, who leaned over to whisper something to her client. Hannah ignored them. She'd spent months preparing for this, rehearsing every word, and she wasn't about to let arrogance shake her resolve. "Your Honor," she began again, her voice growing steadier, "I'm here to defend my father, Michael Wayne, who has been wrongfully accused of embezzling funds. If the court would allow me to present my case." Judge Clayton raised a hand to silence her, the smirk on his face deepening. "Miss Wayne, I'm not sure where you got the idea that a courtroom is a stage for theatrics, but I assure you, this is no place for amateurs." A ripple of murmurs swept through the room again, but this time, Hannah caught a flicker of something in the judge's expression. Annoyance, maybe even discomfort. Good. Let him underestimate her. That was her plan all along. Taking a deep breath, she placed the papers on the table in front of her and unfolded a single document. "Your Honor," she said, louder this time, "I believe this court operates on the principles of justice, not prejudice. If you'll allow me to proceed, I'll prove my father's innocence." The room fell silent. The laughter was gone, replaced by an uncomfortable tension. The judge narrowed his eyes, his smirk faltering for the first time. "You have 5 minutes," he said tersely. "Impress me." Hannah didn't miss the challenge in his tone. She took a step forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table for support as she began. "Your Honor, the prosecution's case is built on incomplete evidence. My father's company's financial records contain discrepancies that point to another party." "Objection," Rachel Grace interrupted, rising to her feet. "This is hearsay at best and speculation at worst. The defendant has no credentials to—" Hannah cut her off. "The defendant has done more research than your entire team," she shot back, her voice sharp as a blade. "And I have the evidence to prove it." Judge Clayton raised a hand to stop them both. His gaze was fixed on Hannah now, and the amusement in his expression had turned into something colder, sharper. "Miss Wayne," he said slowly, "you're treading on very thin ice." "I'm aware, Your Honor," Hannah replied, holding his gaze. "But the truth is worth the risk." For a moment, the courtroom was silent. Judge Clayton leaned back in his chair, studying her with an unreadable expression. Then, with a flick of his hand, he motioned for her to continue. As Hannah began to lay out her argument, the room hung on her every word. She spoke with a precision and confidence that didn't match her age, citing legal precedents and pointing out holes in the prosecution's case with surgical accuracy. Even Rachel Grace looked unsettled, her confident demeanor slipping as she scrambled to counter each of Hannah's points. By the time Hannah finished, the silence in the room was deafening. Judge Clayton leaned forward, his hands steepled in front of him. His voice was low, almost incredulous. "Miss Wayne, who taught you all this?" Hannah met his gaze, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. "My father believed in justice," she said. And I believed in him. The judge stared at her for a long moment, the tension in the room so thick it felt like the air had been pulled from it. Then he leaned back, his expression unreadable. "We'll take a recess," he announced, slamming his gavel down. As the courtroom began to empty, Hannah stood still, her heart pounding. She'd made it through the first round, but the real fight was just beginning. Hannah stepped out of the courtroom, the heavy wooden doors closing behind her with a hollow thud. The air in the hallway felt lighter than the stifling tension inside, but her hands still trembled slightly as she clutched her binder. The whispers from the gallery lingered in her mind, blending with Judge Clayton's smug voice. She tightened her grip on the binder, as if holding onto it could keep her resolve from slipping. She had expected the ridicule, had prepared for it, but that didn't make it easier to bear. Her steps echoed as she made her way to a bench near the courthouse's wide windows. The light from outside spilled in, casting long shadows across the floor, and for a moment, she allowed herself to breathe. "Hannah!" A familiar voice broke through her thoughts, and she looked up to see her father's attorney, Peter Grant, hurrying toward her. He was a grizzled man in his late 50s, with kind eyes and a constant air of exhaustion. "You did good in there," Peter said, though his voice carried a note of hesitation. "But Judge Clayton isn't the type to go easy on anyone, especially not someone like you." Hannah looked at him, her jaw tightening. "Someone like me?" Peter sighed, sitting beside her. A young, unlicensed girl walking into his courtroom and challenging the system. "You know how these people work. They'll use everything they can to make you look like a joke." She didn't respond immediately, her gaze fixed on the bustling street outside. She could feel the weight of her father's case pressing down on her, the way it always did. "I don't care what they think of me," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "This isn't about me, Peter. It's about proving Dad's innocence. He didn't do what they're accusing him of, and I'm not going to let them bury him just because it's convenient." Peter studied her for a moment, his expression softening. "You've got guts, kid. I'll give you that. But guts won't mean much if you don't have the evidence to back it up." "I have the evidence," Hannah said, her eyes flashing with determination. She opened her binder, flipping through the meticulously organized pages. The financial records show discrepancies that the prosecution is ignoring. And this, she pointed to a highlighted section. "This legal precedent completely undermines their argument." Peter leaned over, scanning the page. He let out a low whistle. "You really did your homework." "Of course I did." Her voice was sharper than she intended, but she didn't apologize. "They're coming at us with everything they have. I can't afford to be anything less than prepared." Peter hesitated before speaking again. "You know, Hannah, there's still time to reconsider. Let me take the lead on this. I have experience." "No," she interrupted, her tone firm. "This isn't just another case to you, Peter, but it is to them. To Rachel Grace, to the judge, to everyone else in that courtroom. To them, my father is just another name on a docket. But to me, he's my dad. I have to do this." For a moment, Peter looked as though he might argue. But then he nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You remind me of someone," he said. "Your dad. He was just as stubborn as you are when he believed in something." Hannah's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Guess it runs in the family." Peter stood, brushing imaginary dust off his suit. "All right then. If you're so determined, I won't get in your way. But just know, Judge Clayton won't be the only one trying to knock you down. Rachel Grace is one of the sharpest attorneys in the business. She's not going to sit back and let you unravel her case." "I wouldn't expect her to," Hannah said, standing as well. "But I'm not going to back down either." Peter nodded, his expression a mix of pride and worry. "Just be careful, all right? The courtroom isn't a fair fight, and people like Rachel Grace don't play by the rules." "I'll be ready," Hannah said. As Peter walked away, she sat back down on the bench, her binder still open in her lap. Her thoughts drifted back to her father, locked away in a cell because of lies and greed. She could still hear his voice from their last phone call, calm and reassuring, even as he faced the possibility of losing everything. "You're stronger than you think, kiddo," he'd said. "Don't let them scare you. You've got this." She closed her eyes, letting the memory steady her. She didn't just want to prove his innocence. She needed to. For him. For their family. For everything they'd already lost. As the minutes passed, her resolve hardened like steel beneath a flame. Tomorrow, she would step back into that courtroom, and no matter how much Judge Clayton or Rachel Grace tried to break her, she would fight. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The courtroom was filled with its usual tension the next morning, but today it carried a sharper edge. Hannah Wayne sat at the defense table, her binder neatly arranged before her. She appeared calm, but beneath the surface, her mind raced like a sprinter at the starting line. Every move, every word had to be calculated. There would be no room for mistakes today. Across the room, Rachel Grace exuded confidence. Dressed in a sleek navy suit, she leaned back in her chair with an air of nonchalance, exchanging whispers with her client. Every now and then, her sharp blue eyes flicked toward Hannah, but her expression betrayed no concern. To Rachel, this was just another day at the office, and Hannah was an amateur stepping into a professional's ring. Judge Clayton entered the room with his usual commanding presence, the sharp crack of his gavel demanding silence. His gaze swept over the courtroom before landing on Hannah. The corner of his mouth twitched, almost imperceptibly, as if he were amused by her continued determination. "Let's resume," he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "Miss Wayne, the floor is yours. Let's see if you can make better use of my time today." Hannah stood, her palms pressed flat against the table to steady herself. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she pushed the nerves aside. She had spent the entire night reviewing her strategy, rehearsing every word until it felt like second nature. She couldn't afford to falter now. "Thank you, Your Honor," she began, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit B, specifically, the company's internal financial records from the last quarter." She picked up a printed spreadsheet and held it up for emphasis. The clean, precise columns and rows gleamed under the fluorescent lights. "These records," Hannah continued, "show a series of discrepancies that suggest funds were redirected to an untraceable account. The prosecution has claimed that my father, Michael Wayne, orchestrated this, but the timeline doesn't align." Rachel Grace rose to her feet with a practiced elegance. "Objection, Your Honor," she said, her tone smooth as silk. "This is speculation. Miss Wayne is attempting to introduce evidence without proper foundation." Judge Clayton nodded, his expression unreadable. "Miss Wayne, care to respond?" Hannah nodded, refusing to let the interruption rattle her. "Your Honor, the records were obtained through proper discovery and are admissible as evidence. The discrepancies are documented and undeniable." Clayton leaned back in his chair, considering her argument for a moment. "Proceed," he said finally, his tone curt. Rachel's jaw tightened, but she said nothing as she returned to her seat. For the first time, her confident facade seemed to crack, if only slightly. Hannah took a deep breath and pressed on. "As I was saying, these records show irregularities that coincide with the resignation of a senior accountant, Kevin Harper, who left the company under suspicious circumstances. I've submitted a deposition from Mr. Harper, in which he states that he was pressured to falsify financial reports." The room seemed to hold its breath. Even Judge Clayton's normally impassive expression shifted ever so slightly. He leaned forward, his fingers steepled as he regarded Hannah. "Miss Wayne," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "are you suggesting that the prosecution has overlooked key evidence?" "I'm not suggesting it, Your Honor," Hannah replied, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I'm stating it as fact." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Rachel Grace's pen froze mid-note, her sharp eyes narrowing as she studied Hannah with newfound intensity. For the first time, it seemed, she realized that this wasn't going to be as easy as she'd thought. Judge Clayton raised a hand to silence the room. "Miss Grace," he said, turning his attention to the prosecutor, "I assume you have an explanation for why this wasn't addressed in your initial presentation?" Rachel hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for the room to notice. "Your Honor, the defense's claims are unsubstantiated. The prosecution stands by its evidence." Hannah took the opening. "Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to call Kevin Harper as a witness to verify his deposition. Another wave of murmurs spread through the gallery. Rachel's expression darkened, but she remained silent, her jaw clenched. Judge Clayton tapped his gavel once, silencing the room. Very well, Miss Wayne. You'll have your chance. But let me be clear. If you're wasting this court's time, there will be consequences. I understand, Your Honor, Hannah said, her voice steady. She returned to her seat, her pulse racing. She had won the first skirmish, but the battle was far from over. As the judge called a recess, the gallery began to empty. Hannah remained seated, her hands still clutching the edge of the table. She knew the hardest part was yet to come. If Kevin Harper's testimony didn't hold up, everything she'd worked for would crumble. But deep down, she knew she couldn't stop now. She glanced across the room, catching Rachel Grace's gaze. The prosecutor's polished confidence had been replaced with something colder, more calculating. Hannah allowed herself a small, fleeting smile. For the first time, it felt like she was finally in the fight. Hannah sat alone in the courtroom during the recess, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on her shoulders. The quiet room, with its echoing emptiness, seemed almost too vast, swallowing her thoughts as she replayed the morning's events. She had struck a blow, but now she stood at a crossroads. Kevin Harper's testimony was critical, but she wasn't naive. Witnesses like him, people who knew too much, often came with their own baggage. Her thoughts were interrupted by a low, gruff voice behind her. You've got guts, kid. I'll give you that. Hannah turned, startled, to see a man leaning casually against the doorway. He was in his 50s, his salt and pepper hair slicked back, and his suit looked slightly worn, as if it had seen too many courtrooms. His eyes were sharp, but there was a weariness behind them, like a soldier who'd fought one battle too many. Who are you? She asked, rising to her feet, her binder clutched tightly against her chest. Name's Nick Parker, he said, stepping into the room. Used to be a lawyer, once upon a time. Now? Let's just say I keep an eye on cases like yours. Hannah narrowed her eyes. Why are you here? Nick smirked, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket and tossing it onto the defense table. Because you've got bigger problems than you think. Hannah unfolded the paper, her heart sinking as she scanned it. It was an internal memo from her father's company, one she hadn't seen before. The document implied that Michael Wayne had approved certain transactions, the very ones at the heart of the embezzlement charges. This can't be real, she murmured, her voice trembling. Nick shrugged. It's not. It's a forgery, but it's a good one. And if Rachel Grace gets her hands on it, you can kiss this case goodbye. Hannah looked up at him, her mind racing. How do you know about this? Let's just say I've been keeping tabs on your father's company for a while, Nick said, his tone cryptic. There's a lot more going on than you realize, kid. This isn't just about your dad. Someone high up wants to make sure he takes the fall, and they'll do whatever it takes to make that happen. Why are you telling me this? She demanded, her voice rising. What do you want? Nick's smirk faded, replaced by a serious expression. Because I know what it's like to lose everything to people like them. I've been where you are, fighting a system that's rigged from the start. And I want to help you level the playing field. Hannah hesitated, studying him. Everything about this man screamed trouble, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of sincerity that made her pause. What do you want me to do? She asked finally. Nick stepped closer, lowering his voice. There's an archive in the company's headquarters. It's where they keep the sensitive stuff, files they don't want anyone to see. If you can get in there, you'll find what you need to blow their case wide open. Hannah stared at him, her mind spinning. You're asking me to break into a corporate archive? That's insane. Maybe, Nick said with a shrug, but it's your best shot. You've already proven you're willing to fight, kid. Now you just need the right weapon. She glanced down at the memo again, her fingers tightening around the paper. If what Nick said was true, then she didn't have a choice. Without solid evidence, her father's case would crumble and Rachel Grace would walk away victorious. Fine, she said, her voice firm. But if I do this, you're coming with me. Nick chuckled, the sound low and gravelly. I wouldn't miss it. That evening, under the cover of darkness, Hannah and Nick parked a block away from the company's headquarters. The building loomed ahead of them, its glass facade glinting under the streetlights like a fortress. "This place is locked up tighter than a drum," Nick muttered, glancing at the security cameras mounted along the exterior. "We've got maybe 20 minutes before someone notices we're here." Hannah adjusted the strap of her backpack, her heart pounding in her chest. "Then let's not waste time." Nick led the way, his movements surprisingly nimble for someone his age. They slipped through a side entrance that Nick had somehow managed to unlock, the door closing softly behind them. Inside, the air was cold and sterile, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence. "Archives on the second floor," Nick whispered. "Keep an eye out for security." Hannah nodded, her adrenaline surging as they crept through the dimly lit hallways. Every shadow felt like a threat, every sound like an alarm. But she pushed her fear aside, focusing on the task at hand. When they reached the archive room, Nick pulled out a set of tools and began working on the lock. Hannah stood guard, her eyes darting toward the hallway. "Hurry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm going as fast as I can," Nick muttered, his fingers working deftly. Finally, the lock clicked, and the door swung open. Inside, rows of filing cabinets stretched out before them, each one labeled with a series of numbers and letters. "Start looking," Nick said, stepping aside to let her in. Hannah didn't waste a second. She moved down the rows, scanning the labels for anything that matched the transactions in her father's case. Her hands shook as she opened drawers, rifling through folders and documents. "Got something," Nick said suddenly, holding up a thick folder. Hannah rushed over, her eyes widening as she flipped through the pages. It was all there. Proof that the transactions had been orchestrated by senior executives, not her father. "This is it," she said, her voice trembling with relief. But their moment of triumph was short-lived. From somewhere down the hall, the sound of footsteps echoed toward them. Nick swore under his breath. "We've got company." Hannah's heart raced as she shoved the folder into her backpack. "What do we do?" "Follow my lead," Nick said, his expression grim. And with that, the chase began. The sound of footsteps grew louder, each step a countdown to disaster. Hannah's pulse raced as she followed Nick down the dimly lit hallway, her backpack weighing heavily on her shoulders. Inside it was everything they needed to turn the case around. But only if they got out of the building in time. "Stay close," Nick hissed, his voice barely above a whisper as he glanced over his shoulder. His face was tense, his usual nonchalance replaced by laser-sharp focus. "If they see us, we're done." Hannah nodded, her breath shallow. The corporate archive had been easy enough to slip into, but getting out was proving to be a different story. Security guards patrolled the halls like clockwork, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. Nick led her through a maze of corridors, his movements quick and deliberate. Every now and then, he'd stop abruptly, motioning for her to stay still as a flashlight beam swept past. The air was thick with tension, the kind that seemed to cling to the walls. They were almost at the exit when the sound of a voice froze them in their tracks. "Hey, who's there?" Hannah's heart dropped. A guard stepped into the hallway ahead of them, his flashlight aimed directly at their faces. For a moment, no one moved, the silence stretching unbearably. Nick reacted first. "Sorry, sir," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. His voice was calm, almost casual, as if they'd just been caught loitering. "We got turned around. We're part of the cleaning crew." The guard narrowed his eyes, his flashlight sweeping over them. "Cleaning crew? Huh? Where's your ID?" Nick hesitated, but Hannah stepped forward before he could speak. "We left it downstairs," she said quickly, her voice steady despite the panic surging through her. "We were just about to head back. Sorry for the trouble." The guard didn't look convinced. He took a step closer, his expression hardening. "I'm going to need you both to come with me." Nick cursed under his breath, his calm facade cracking. "All right," he said, taking a step forward. "We'll." Before he could finish, Hannah moved. With a quick, deliberate motion, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small spray bottle she'd stashed there earlier. She aimed it at the guard's face and pressed the nozzle, sending a fine mist of water and vinegar into his eyes. The guard recoiled with a shout, his flashlight clattering to the ground. "What the? Run!" Nick barked, grabbing Hannah's arm and pulling her down the hall. They sprinted toward the exit, the sound of the guards' shouts echoing behind them. Hannah's lungs burned, and her legs felt like they might give out, but she didn't dare slow down. The exit door came into view, the faint glow of the streetlights outside like a beacon. Nick shoved the door open, and they burst into the cool night air. He pulled Hannah around the corner of the building, pressing her against the wall as they caught their breath. The sound of their ragged breathing mingled with the distant hum of the city. That, Nick said between gasps, was a hell of a move. Hannah looked at him, her chest heaving. You said follow your lead. I improvised. Nick let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. You've got nerve, I'll give you that. He peeked around the corner, scanning for any signs of pursuit. Looks like we're clear. Let's get out of here before they call the cops. They made their way back to Nick's car, parked a block away. The tension in the air didn't lift until they were safely inside, the engine humming as they drove into the city. Hannah sat in the passenger seat, her backpack clutched tightly against her chest. The folder inside felt like a lifeline, proof that she wasn't crazy for believing in her father's innocence. But the memory of the guard's face, the way he'd recoiled in pain, gnawed at her. She wasn't proud of what she'd done, even if it had been necessary. You all right, kid? Nick asked, glancing at her as he navigated the dark streets. She nodded, though her voice betrayed her doubt. I think so. You did what you had to do, he said, his tone firm. Don't let it eat at you. This isn't a game. If we hadn't gotten out of there, your dad wouldn't stand a chance. Hannah looked out the window, the city lights blurring as they sped past. She knew he was right, but it didn't make the knot in her stomach any smaller. What's next? She asked after a long silence. Nick smirked, his confidence returning. Next, we take this to the courtroom and watch Rachel Grace squirm. You've got what you need to blow her case apart. Hannah nodded, determination hardening her features. She'd come too far to let doubt or guilt hold her back now. Her father was counting on her, and she wouldn't let him down. As they disappeared into the night, the folder in her backpack seemed to hum with potential. Tomorrow, everything would change. The morning sunlight poured into the courthouse, casting sharp beams across the polished wooden floors. Hannah stepped into the courtroom, her backpack slung over one shoulder, feeling the weight of the folder pressing against her back like an unspoken promise. Today was the day she would put everything on the line. Judge Clayton's sharp gaze landed on her as soon as she entered. He adjusted his robe and leaned forward, his expression a mix of curiosity and irritation. Miss Wayne, he said dryly, I trust you've prepared something worth this court's time. Hannah ignored the murmurs that rippled through the gallery. She set her backpack on the defense table and pulled out the folder, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Yes, Your Honor, she said firmly. I have evidence that will exonerate my father and expose the real culprits behind the alleged embezzlement. Across the room, Rachel Grace arched an eyebrow, her lips curving into a faint smirk. This should be interesting, she murmured to her client. Judge Clayton tapped his gavel once, his voice cutting through the room. Proceed. Hannah took a deep breath, stepping forward with the folder in hand. Your Honor, the prosecution's case is built on the assumption that my father, Michael Wayne, orchestrated a series of fraudulent transactions to siphon funds from his company. However, the evidence I'm presenting today tells a very different story. She opened the folder, pulling out a set of documents. These records, retrieved from the company's internal archives, show a trail of transactions authorized by senior executives, transactions that were deliberately hidden to implicate my father. Rachel stood abruptly. Objection, Your Honor. These documents haven't been authenticated. The defense cannot introduce evidence without proper verification. Judge Clayton raised a hand to silence her. Sit down, Miss Grace. I'll decide what's admissible. Rachel hesitated, her confident demeanor faltering for a split second before she returned to her seat. Her sharp eyes locked on Hannah, her expression a mix of annoyance and caution. Hannah continued, her voice gaining strength. The records also include emails between the executives, discussing their plan to frame my father as a scapegoat. These emails, she held up another set of papers, clearly demonstrate intent and coordination. The room fell silent. Even Judge Clayton leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the documents. "Your Honor," Hannah said, her voice unwavering, "I request that these documents be reviewed by a forensic analyst to confirm their authenticity. But I believe they speak for themselves." The judge tapped his gavel lightly, his expression unreadable. "Miss Grace, do you have anything to say?" Rachel rose slowly, her expression carefully controlled. "Your Honor, this is a blatant attempt to derail the prosecution's case. These so-called documents could have been fabricated." "They weren't," Hannah interrupted, her voice cutting through the room. "And you know it." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Rachel's composure cracked, her eyes narrowing as she glared at Hannah. "Miss Wayne," Judge Clayton said sharply, "you will not interrupt opposing counsel." Hannah nodded, her expression calm but determined. "Apologies, Your Honor. But I stand by the evidence." The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. "Very well. The court will recess while the documents are reviewed. Bailiff, ensure these are delivered to a forensic analyst immediately." As the gavel struck, the tension in the room lingered like a heavy fog. The gallery began to empty, but Hannah remained seated, her hands gripping the edge of the table. She could feel Rachel's gaze burning into her, but she didn't look up. When the courtroom finally cleared, Rachel approached her, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "You've got guts, kid," she said, her voice low and icy. "But don't think for a second that you've won." Hannah met her gaze, her expression unflinching. "This isn't about winning. It's about the truth." Rachel smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Truth doesn't matter in places like this. Power does. And you're playing a game you don't understand." Hannah didn't respond, her silence speaking louder than any words could. Rachel studied her for a moment longer before turning and walking away, her confidence returning with every step. Hours later, the court reconvened. The forensic analyst stood at the witness stand, holding a report in one hand. The room was silent as Judge Clayton addressed him. "Mr. Harris, have you reviewed the documents submitted by the defense?" "Yes, Your Honor," the analyst replied. "And my findings are conclusive. The documents are authentic. There is no evidence of tampering." A gasp rippled through the gallery. Rachel's face darkened, her hand tightening around the pen she held. Judge Clayton turned to Hannah. "Miss Wayne, it appears your evidence holds weight. Do you wish to proceed?" "Yes, Your Honor," Hannah said, standing. She walked to the front of the courtroom, her confidence radiating. "This evidence not only exonerates my father, but also implicates the senior executives of the company in a deliberate effort to frame him. I request that the court subpoena these individuals for questioning." The judge considered her request, his expression thoughtful. After a long pause, he nodded. "Request granted." Rachel stood, her voice sharp. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "This court has seen enough irregularities, Miss Grace," Judge Clayton interrupted, his tone icy. "Perhaps it's time we uncovered the truth." For the first time, Rachel looked genuinely rattled. She sank back into her seat, her confidence evaporating. Hannah returned to her seat, her heart pounding. She had done it. She had turned the tide. But she knew this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over yet, and the real battle was just beginning. The courtroom was packed to capacity the next morning. News of the explosive evidence had spread quickly, drawing journalists, onlookers, and even other legal professionals curious to see how this David and Goliath battle would unfold. Hannah Wayne sat at the defense table, her hands folded neatly over her binder. On the surface, she appeared calm, but beneath the facade, her nerves were a taut wire ready to snap. Judge Clayton entered, his gavel striking down hard enough to silence the bustling crowd. "Let's get straight to it," he said, his voice carrying an edge of impatience. His sharp eyes flicked toward Rachel Grace, whose once polished demeanor now seemed frayed at the edges. "Miss Grace, do you have anything to counter the defense's evidence?" Rachel rose, her steps deliberate but lacking their usual grace. She cleared her throat, clutching a folder like a lifeline. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carefully measured. "While the evidence presented by the defense is compelling, it does not prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant was uninvolved. At best, It points to negligence within the company. Hannah stood before the judge could respond. Your Honor, with all due respect, the evidence isn't just compelling. It's irrefutable. The financial records, emails, and depositions paint a clear picture. My father was framed by senior executives looking to cover their own tracks. Judge Clayton held up a hand, silencing her. Miss Wayne, I've allowed you more latitude in this case than I would under normal circumstances. Don't test my patience. Yes, Your Honor, Hannah said, sitting back down. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she refused to let doubt creep in. The truth was on her side, and she wasn't going to let anyone twist it. The judge turned his attention back to Rachel. Do you have any substantive evidence to refute the defense's claims? Rachel hesitated. Her silence stretched uncomfortably long, and murmurs rippled through the courtroom. For the first time, her confidence seemed to falter entirely. Finally, she exhaled and sank back into her chair. No, Your Honor. A gasp spread through the gallery, followed by the furious scratching of pens from journalists scribbling notes. Hannah couldn't believe it. Rachel Grace, the formidable prosecutor, was conceding defeat. Judge Clayton leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable as he addressed the court. In light of the defense's evidence and the lack of a credible counterargument from the prosecution, I find that the charges against Michael Wayne are unsupported. This court hereby dismisses all charges. The gavel struck down with a decisive thud, and the room erupted into chaos. Cheers and applause filled the air as reporters rushed to the front for comments. Hannah sat frozen in her seat, the weight of the moment crashing over her like a wave. She had done it. Her father was free. Michael Wayne, seated behind her, rose to his feet, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. Hannah, he said softly, his voice barely audible over the noise. She turned to him, and he pulled her into a tight embrace, his arms trembling. You did it, kiddo. You saved me. Hannah clung to him, her own tears spilling over. You believed in me, she whispered. I just returned the favor. As the courtroom emptied, Judge Clayton lingered at his bench, watching Hannah from across the room. When the last of the crowd had dispersed, he called out, Miss Wayne. Hannah turned, her shoulders stiffening as she approached the bench. Yes, Your Honor. He studied her for a long moment, his stern expression softening just enough to reveal something unexpected. Respect. I underestimated you, he admitted. That doesn't happen often. Thank you, Your Honor, she said, her voice steady. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. You're good, Miss Wayne. Very good. But let me give you a piece of advice. If you want to make a career out of this, do it the right way. Get your degree, pass the bar, and join the ranks. Don't waste your talent on shortcuts. Hannah nodded. I will, Your Honor. But today, I did what I had to do. Clayton's lips twitched into what might have been a smile. Fair enough. Court adjourned. Later that evening, Hannah and her father returned home to their small but cozy house. The quiet hum of the fridge and the faint creak of the floorboards felt like a welcome contrast to the chaos of the courtroom. Michael sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. I still can't believe it, he said, shaking his head. You stood up to them all. Judge Clayton, Rachel Grace, the entire system, and you won? Hannah sat across from him, a faint smile on her lips. I didn't do it alone, she said. Nick helped. And so did you. Everything you taught me, about fairness, about standing up for what's right. It's the reason I could do this. Michael reached across the table, placing a hand over hers. You've got a gift, Hannah. Don't stop now. The world needs people like you. Her smile widened, though it was tinged with exhaustion. I'm not stopping, Dad. This is just the beginning. A week later, Hannah stood outside the courthouse once again, this time for her father's formal exoneration. The press buzzed around her, cameras flashing and microphones thrust in her direction. She answered their questions politely, but kept her focus on the bigger picture. As she left the courthouse, Nick Parker was waiting for her at the bottom of the steps. He leaned against a lamppost, a faint smirk on his face. Told you you'd make it out alive. Hannah grinned. Couldn't have done it without you. Nick shrugged. Maybe. But you've got something special, kid. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. She nodded, the weight of his words settling in. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe again. The fight was over, but her journey was just beginning. As she walked away, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the courthouse steps. Hannah Wayne wasn't just a girl who had defended her father. She was a force to be reckoned with. And the world was about to find out.